Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey may be his best film yet. But what does it mean? Is it a faithful retelling of a classic epic? No, but faithful is a strange standard to hold this story to. The Odyssey wasn't written so much as accumulated, generations of oral performance, reshaped by every singer who told it, long before anyone wrote a word of it down. There was never a fixed original to be unfaithful to, only ever another retelling, which is, as it turns out, is in the very spirit of the hero. So is this telling a piece of political propaganda? No, not for any side of the clickbait-engineered cultural divide currently trying to frame it as such. Nolan does cast across race for gods and mortals alike, which angered some conservatives. But he did this in service of an idea that is much harder to pin down politically, and much more interesting. More on that in a minute. On the surface, the film's message isn't hard to see or disagree with. It keeps returning to a single value that both liberals and conservatives alike ostensibly accept in some way: hospitality, portrayed here as the sacred custom binding Greek civilization together. I suppose one could read that as a straightforward progressive message, especially in the context of diverse casting, an ethic of welcoming the outsider. Except that the film spends nearly 3 hours mourning the collapse of tradition and the cultural decay that makes societies vulnerable to threats, both outside and within. A rot of values that makes us incapable of safely accepting a stranger into our homes. A common conservative complaint, right? Yet the film isn't caught up in the melodrama of blame for this situation. It is much more interested in why this happens again and again in different ways throughout history. It's interesting to see people put politics aside to appreciate this film, because it shows they could do the same for the issue it explores, the question which lies at the heart of politics itself. The question that, while we all might want to be open and kind to the other, what must be actually in place, for that to be a safe and a natural thing? Of course, all depends on the social and historical specifics, but Nolan seems to be saying that even millennia of time between the Homeric Greeks and us doesn't change the form the answer takes all that much. If we look at his diverse casting choices, I think this reflects the desire to portray the world at the time as one just like our own, one struggling with the challenges of cosmopolitanism, of a world no longer defined by local custom, but one made more diverse, but also more chaotic and dangerous through commercial interests and imperialism. This is clearly more a structural issue than a lack of traditional manners or a lack of compassion for the stranger. If there is anyone to blame for this, it is those with selfish ambitions driving changes in society, right? But in a world in so much flux, a world without sincere tradition, without it speaking in a voice you can believe, telling you what is right and what is wrong, people everywhere are going to look out for themselves first. And in such a world, the most cunning man is going to come out on top. In the film, that man is Odysseus, post-traditional, pragmatic, endlessly resourceful, but resourceful partly because he still has a foot in the world of the gods. He is a man poised at the precipice between two worlds. I think this story, especially Nolan's version of the story, captures something essential about this time we are living in. A time when media is rapidly changing consciousness and a new unsettling world is on the horizon. It is no coincidence that people have started talking again about the bicameral mind. If you haven't heard of it, the psychologist Julian Jaynes' idea was that early humans had no inner monologue the way we do, that the voice of a god giving instructions was closer to a hallucinated command from one side of our mind, and that ego consciousness, the felt sense of a private eye doing the deciding, is a comparatively recent invention, a historical event with a beginning. Jaynes even cites the Odyssey as evidence of this transition from earlier consciousness, since in the Iliad the characters do as the gods command, while Odysseus and other characters calculate in a way closer to modern consciousness. AI has made this all quite relevant again. For most of modern history, the story ran one direction, away from external voices towards a progressively individual consciousness, gods giving way to a self that generates its own thoughts privately. AI, though, seems to be reversing that era, or at least heading there, a situation where the authoritative voices dictate the truth to us directly into our heads. Scary. But Odysseus at this time emerges for us as a model of someone who faced a similar transition, not only in society but in consciousness. And He figured out a middle path between the chaos of a world of diverse conflicting voices and a reduction to simple selfish individualism. The lesson seems to be that the path can only be found by making one's own meaning. Not through selfish determination, though, but an ethical decision driving a narrative synthesis. The film makes this explicit. Most of the story is framed as something Odysseus is remembering, surfacing out of a lotus-induced dream, piecing his own journey together as he tells it to Calypso. We're never simply shown what happened. We're shown a man constructing it out loud for a listener to find his way out of a trance of communion with divine and semi-divine beings like Athena and Calypso. That's the same nested reality grammar Nolan has used his whole career. Dreaming inside dream, memory and time, forming in many directions. Except here it isn't a puzzle box. It's basically the meaning of consciousness itself, creating unity and will out of multiplicity through stories we tell, not as a solitary self, but as a process of becoming. In fact, Homer's own word for Odysseus in the poem's opening line is polytropos, the man of many turns. He's a hero who lies, calculates, hides his own name, invents himself moment to moment. Nolan's Odysseus is experiencing something like Kierkegaard's dizziness of freedom. He is not imprisoned by Calypso at all, but ironically by his own freedom, by awareness of the consequences of his actions. No longer just a tool of the gods, he sees how we can choose, but is also aware of the limits of consequence. He feels guilty for what his choices have cost, not only as men, but in some way all of his society. He built the horse, after all, turning the Trojans' own piety, their reverence for an offering left to the gods, into the weapon that ended them. He beat them with the very tradition that held his own society together and kept his family safe. Some deeper part of him at that time suspected, probably, that an intelligence capable of a trick like that won't stay contained on a battlefield. It will spread, hollowing out the same customs that Ithaca, that it hollowed out in Troy. But notice where this confession happens, inside the telling to Calypso, from within a dream he hasn't fully left yet. The horse doesn't sit in his past as a fixed, finished fact he's simply reporting. It becomes what is basically his betrayal, debt, guilt. It's in the act of narrating it because the meaning creates the will. Nolan gives us the clearest version of this idea of meaning-creating will as Odysseus tells Penelope about Agamemnon's daughter and how he sacrificed her. Penelope just says it looks like cruelty, but Odysseus, he doesn't disagree. He points out that the determination that act takes was immense. It was like a personal sacrifice that had a lot of emotion that made the war almost inevitable and irreversible. There was no going home then without victory, and really no going home at all for these men after what they had to do. An important point is that opening line of the film, in a time of apparent magic. Now, apparent is used, I think, not because it's just appearances, but as scholars have noticed it in Homer, there's a sense of double determination where things can be seen as caused by either supernatural or psychological forces equally because they are different levels or perspectives of the same phenomenon. Of course, if what one wants is to be self-determined, being completely determined by either one's acquired character or the gods is bad either way, right? One must think for oneself to avoid these two pitfalls. That doubleness is arguably also the shape of the film's and the story's most essential image, the strait between the whirlpool and the monster. On one side, dissolution, the pull back into an undifferentiated collective tradition with no individuating friction left in it. On the other side, a monster with 6 mouths and nothing else, pure appetite, wearing the shape of the self. Odysseus has to steer his men between the two, and the film is careful to show that neither failure comes from the outside, really. Circe already told him what the crew becomes when they're turned into pigs. They don't become anything. They were always that. Fate, whether by divine decree, nature, or magic, just determine the consequences of their character. Back home, the suitors are the same, a sign of a society too preoccupied with material interest to notice the signs of its downfall and correct course. This undermines society from within, whether or not there is any barbarism at the gate. Meaning the threat is never really foreign, right? It is always about what a civilization does to itself when it loses its yoke to static tradition without finding some kind of becoming, higher than mere selfish gain. Odysseus, however, gets home by finding a middle path. He leaves the dream, stops letting gods and traditions simply speak through him, But he also accepts that his earlier use of reason for selfish and vengeful aims was incorrect. He takes up a voice of his own cunning, adaptive willingness to act for his own survival. But he doesn't become the monster either. He slaughters the suitors pretty brutally, but only the ones that threaten his return. He lets those that honor his place in his home live. He finds a way to honor his men that doesn't bog him down in dogma that could cost him or his son their lives. He becomes, by the end, something closer to pure becoming than to fixed identity. Fluid, resourceful, a man of many turns to the last frame. Earlier in the story, as it is told in the book anyway, he mistakenly tells the Cyclops' name as he sails away, as a boast for outsmarting him, which is framed as the cause of the sea god's wrath. While no one leaves this part out, Odysseus in any case must let go of the pride and attachment to his identity that drove Achilles in particular in the Iliad and the Greeks as a whole into the indulgence of imperial war. Odysseus leaves his son on a throne he already knows is temporary, not because he knows his son will fail necessarily, but because the middle ground he found was a long way from becoming a new, higher social order, as it still is. And so a man who can turn different ways to avoid the obstacles and pitfalls of any static order must leave society to its cycles of rising and falling fate. The film's closing movement gestures at exactly this, at the Bronze Age collapse waiting just past the story's edge, a collapse of literacy and memory itself in the wake of war. And maybe that's why this particular adaptation arrives now, right as we've started wondering out loud whether something genuinely new is happening in the shape of a human mind, whether a technology fluent in the accumulated voice of everyone who ever wrote anything down is pulling us back towards something like the God voice, or pushing us further into isolated selfishness, or harder, less comfortable option, the one Odysseus maybe finds at the bottom of his own dream, showing us the two were never really that different to begin with. Maybe? I think so. Because the self is never really built alone. That voice you think of as only yours was always on some level a chorus you need to learn to steer. Thank you.